What you're about to hear was never meant to survive the century that buried it. Somewhere, deep in the Carolina winter of 1852, two men screamed into a forest so silent, so frozen, that their cries echoed like ghosts, and no one came to help them, because the only witnesses were the hounds. The Harding plantation was a place where rules were not written in books, but carved into flesh. It was a kingdom of fear, 800 acres of quiet tyranny, where dawn began with a bell that meant obey or bleed. For the men who ruled it, Ernest Harding and his son Jasper, cruelty was not a tool. It was an art. They had perfected it through public whippings, starvation, and perhaps most terrifying of all, the dogs. 6 bloodhounds, trained since puppyhood, were kept in a special kennel just yards from the main house, as if they were part of the family. To the Hardings they were. Each dog had a name, each was groomed, fed, kept strong, but also kept hungry. Their hunger was a message. They were not just animals, they were the plantation's living curse, trained to hunt any slave who dared imagine freedom. Simon grew up feeding those hounds. At 14, he learned to hold their gaze without flinching, to prepare their meals, to ready them for the chase. The Hardings thought they had tamed him as well, that by giving him this role, this twisted privilege, they had secured his loyalty. But they had not tamed him. They had forged him. Every scream he heard during the hunts, every body he saw dragged back, every memory of his sister being sold, every hour he sat powerless beside his mother's grave, all of it went into him like iron into a blade. For 20 years, Simon smiled, nodded, obeyed. And in that obedience, he was becoming something the Hardings could never see until it was too late. A man who understood their every weakness. When the night finally came, he did not rue in. He did not hide. He fed the hounds, and then he fed them something else. You must understand something before we go any further. Simon was not a man of sudden rage. He was a man of patience, and patience, when mixed with hatred, becomes the most dangerous force on earth. From the moment his sister was chained and taken from Harding Plantation, Simon began counting the days, not toward escape, but toward reckoning. The Hardings thought they had broken him. They mistook silence for surrender, but silence can be a forge, and in that forge, Simon became steel. He studied everything. The exact times Ernest and Jasper woke, the routes they rode on horseback, the patterns of their drinking, the sound of the carriage wheels, the smell of the dogs when they were just fed versus when they were hungry. He learned the overseer's footsteps in the dark, knew which floorboards in the main house creaked, which doors stuck in the winter frost. He became invisible, not by hiding, but by being exactly what they expected him to be. The obedient boy who grew into the obedient man, the one they trusted to handle the very creatures that terrified every other slave on the property. But behind those calm eyes, Simon was doing mathematics, counting how many years it would take until Ernest's confidence in him was absolute, how many years until no one would question him being near the hounds, near the weapons, near the road at night. And as he waited, something strange happened. The hounds became his, not by any formal claim, but by the quiet, slow magic of daily care. He knew their hunger rhythms, their injuries, their favorite scents. He whispered to them when no one was watching, and over time, those animals stopped seeing Simon as the enemy. They trusted him. That trust became his weapon. By the winter of 1852, Simon was no longer just a caretaker. He was a man with a war to fight, and the perfect army waiting for his command. And here is where most men fail to grasp the depth of this story. Simon did not simply dream of killing the Hardings. That would have been too simple, too merciful. He wanted them to understand, to feel the same terror they had spent decades teaching others to feel. And the first step of his plan was not murder. It was to make sure the forest itself would become their courtroom. The night before the Hardings left for Charleston was bitter, a wind cutting through the slave quarters like a blade. Most of the men huddled around dying fires, too exhausted to speak, too cold to dream. But Simon was awake. sitting on the edge of his bunk, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on the darkness, as if he could already see the blood that would soon stain the snow. Joshua sat across from him, the scarred welts on his back glowing faintly in the moonlight. They hadn't spoken much since the night Simon first made him the offer, an offer of revenge so complete it almost sounded like myth. But now, on this final night, Joshua's breathing was loud, uneven, fear and anticipation in every breath. "You still with me?" Simon whispered. Joshua nodded once, jaw clenched. "I've been with you since the first lash." That was enough. There were no speeches between them, no dramatic oaths. Both men knew what waited in the morning, and in that silence, Simon reviewed every step of his plan, for the 100th time. The location, the trap, the dogs, the timing, everything had to be perfect. Out in the kennels, the hounds were restless. They could smell the shift in Simon's scent, the tension that no man could hide from an animal's nose. He fed them just enough to quiet their hunger, but not enough to dull their edge. When morning came, they would be ready, not as the Hardings' weapons, but as Simon's. Hours crawled by, each one colder than the last. Simon lay down but did not sleep. He thought of his sister's face the last time he saw her, the way she looked back at him as the wagon rolled away. He thought of his mother's hands, callous, red and cracked, folded on her chest in the shallow grave behind the quarters. And he thought of Thorne's body, broken in the woods, a rehearsal for something greater. When the first pale light touched the horizon, Simon rose without hesitation. He dressed slowly, like a man preparing for a ceremony, because that is what this was, not murder, not rebellion, a ritual. Today the hunters would become the hunted. The forest was so quiet that morning it felt alive, as if the pines themselves were holding their breath. Simon and Joshua moved through the underbrush like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by frost. The bear trap was heavy, but they carried it without a sound, setting it in the precise spot Simon had chosen years earlier, where the road narrowed, where the trees formed a natural tunnel. When it was done, Simon knelt beside the device, adjusting the camouflage until not a trace of iron could be seen beneath the leaves. Joshua stood guard, eyes darting nervously between the road and the tree line. The air was so cold it stung the lungs, every breath visible, every sound sharper than usual. Then came the distant creak of wooden wheels. Simon's chest didn't tighten, his heart didn't race. It slowed, as if his entire body had been waiting for this sound, and now, finally, it could relax. He pressed a finger to his lips. Joshua nodded and melted back into the shadows. The carriage came into view, horses steaming in the frigid air, Ernest Harding sitting tall and wrapped in a fur coat, Jasper beside him, with that same smug, cruel smirk Simon had memorized 1,000 times. They were talking casually, their voices carrying through the trees, unaware that the forest had already chosen their fate. The front wheel struck the hidden trap. The sound, the sudden snap of iron closing, was deafening, unnatural like a gunshot. The horses screamed and reared, the carriage lurched, heaved violently, and the world seemed to tilt as wood splintered and wheels shattered. Ernest and Jasper were thrown onto the frozen ground, snow and dirt exploding around them. Ernest howled as the trap bit deep into his ankle, bone crunching. He clawed at the metal, blood already soaking through his boot. Jasper tried to rise but was still stunned, his face white with shock. And then Simon stepped from the trees. He was calm, almost serene, an axe handle in his hands. Joshua appeared from the other side, rope ready. The Hardings looked at them, and for the first time in their lives understood fear not as an idea, but as a living thing. This was no rebellion. This was judgment. Ernest Harding's scream turned into a strangled cry as Joshua forced the gag into his mouth. The rope bit into his wrists with ruthless efficiency, a mirror of the countless restraints he had ordered placed on other men. Jasper, still dazed, tried to rise to his knees, spitting curses that sounded weak, almost childish against the frozen air. Simon didn't strike him. Not yet. He simply placed the flat of the axe blade under Jasper's chin and lifted his head until their eyes met. It was the first time Simon had ever looked Jasper in the face without lowering his own. "You're not the hunter anymore," Simon said, his voice low, even. It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. They dragged the Hardings off the road, deeper into the woods, the overturned carriage left behind like a carcass for anyone to find. The forest was eerily still, the sound of cracking branches under their boots the only witness. Ernest struggled, but the bear trap's teeth had crushed his ankle too badly. Blood trailed behind him, marking the snow in a dark, uneven path. Simon was not careless. He chose his direction carefully, leading them not toward freedom, but toward the place that had defined their power, the kennels. The journey was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Every step forced Ernest and Jasper closer to the very animals they had used to terrorize others. The smell of the hounds reached them before the kennels came into view, the sharp, feral musk that had haunted every runaway's nightmare. Joshua glanced at Simon as if to ask whether this was really happening, whether they were truly about to cross the invisible line that separated fantasy from action. Simon's face was unreadable, a mask carved from years of pain. When they reached the kennels, the dogs were already pacing, restless, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Their low growls vibrated through the wooden walls, teeth flashing in the gloom. Simon secured Ernest and Jasper to the outer fence, their breath steaming in the frigid air, their eyes wide with a terror they had never been forced to feel. He did not speak to them. Words were no longer needed. He simply opened the first kennel door. The hounds erupted. The first hound burst out of the kennel in a blur of muscle and steam, snow scattering beneath its paws. But it didn't lunge for the men. It ran straight to Simon, circling him once, tail stiff, waiting. Simon knelt and pulled a scrap of salted pork from the sack he had carried from the quarters. The smell filled the cold air instantly. Sharp, greasy, primal. The hound's ears went back, its body trembling with hunger. Simon fed it. He let Ernest and Jasper watch the dog tear the meat apart, hear the crunch of its teeth, see the blood streak across the snow. Then he whistled once, low and sharp, and the hound backed off. Not sated, but disciplined, licking its muzzle, eyes fixed on Simon as if awaiting the next command. One by one, Simon released the others. 6 great hounds, each one a weapon, each one a memory of every night the Hardings had sent them after some terrified soul running barefoot through the woods. Joshua stood guard with the axe, his chest rising and falling too fast, his breath clouding the air. The sight of the dogs unsettled him too, but Simon was calm. He had been preparing them for this for months, feeding them less and less, making them rely on his hand, his voice. He turned to Ernest and Jasper, kneeling in the snow. Their faces were pale, their bodies rigid. Jasper tried to speak through the gag, a muffled roar of anger, but his eyes betrayed him. They were wide, wild. Simon spoke at last, but not to them. His words were for the forest, for the night, for every ghost that had ever haunted this land. "These dogs have tasted the blood of the innocent," he said softly. "Tonight they taste justice." He fed them again, but just enough to make them hungrier, more desperate, their growls turning to deep, guttural whines. Then he tossed the last scrap of pork just short of where Ernest knelt, close enough that the dog's teeth snapped inches from his leg before Simon called them back. This was not punishment. It was education. For the first time in their lives, Ernest and Jasper understood what it meant to be prey, to know the predator could strike at any moment, and that mercy was not coming. And Simon had only just begun. Night fell like a lid over the forest. The cold deepened, the wind turned sharp, and the trees swayed like black silhouettes against the pale moon. Simon waited until the last light had drained from the sky before he moved. He untied Ernest and Jasper from the fence, but left their hands bound. He didn't speak a word as he motioned for Joshua to bring the rope. Together they fashioned crude leashes, fastening them around the men's necks like collars. Jasper thrashed, spitting curses into the gag, but the pull of the rope was merciless. Ernest limped heavily, every movement sending fresh blood across the snow. Simon led them into the woods. The hounds followed at a distance, pacing silently, their breath steaming in the moonlight. Their glowing eyes blinked between the trees like lanterns. The sound of their padded feet in the snow was almost worse than growling. Soft, patient, always there. Simon knew every inch of these woods. He took them down the same trails where the Hardings had once hunted escapees for sport. Every turn, every branch they passed carried ghosts. Simon could still hear the cries from those nights, see the torchlight on the trunks, smell the iron tang of blood on the leaves. He stopped at a clearing where a half-dead oak leaned like a broken cross. This was where Silas had been caught. Silas, the man who had nearly made it to freedom before Jasper sent the dogs after him and watched them tear him down. Simon turned Ernest and Jasper so they could see the tree. "You remember this place," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You remember what you did here? How many times did you bring them back to this clearing?" Jasper made a sound through the gag. Whether denial or defiance, it didn't matter. Simon knelt in front of him, staring into his eyes. "You made the rules," he said softly. "You taught the dogs to hunt men. You told us the forest was a place of judgment. Tonight, you'll learn what that really means." He signaled Joshua. The hounds began to circle. Slowly at first, then faster, their growls rising like a chant. Ernest and Jasper twisted against their restraints, panic finally breaking through their aristocratic pride. The hunters had been brought back to their own hunting ground, and now the night belonged to Simon. Simon stood in the clearing, the moon cutting across his face like a blade. The hounds were restless now, their circles tighter, their breath harsher, their claws scraping lines in the frozen ground. Simon let the silence stretch until even Joshua shifted uneasily. Then he knelt, cutting the ropes that bound Ernest and Jasper's hands. Freedom, but not the kind they wanted. Ernest stared at him, disbelieving. Jasper yanked the gag from his mouth and spat into the snow. "You think you'll get away with this?" he snarled, his voice hoarse. Simon didn't answer. He just nodded toward the tree line. "Run," he said. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Simon whistled, a low, sharp sound. The hounds, tensed, muscles coiled, ready to spring. Ernest's breathing quickened. Jasper's smirk faltered. Simon said it again, quieter this time, as if speaking to children. "Run!" Jasper grabbed Ernest by the arm, pulling him toward the dark trail. Ernest stumbled on his ruined ankle but managed to keep his footing. The two of them disappeared into the trees, crashing through the undergrowth, their breaths ragged. Simon waited. He let them get far enough that the night swallowed their footsteps, then whistled once more. A different pitch. The hounds exploded forward, 6 shadows streaking into the darkness, their baying ripping through the forest like a war cry. Joshua's hands were shaking now, but Simon was still, almost eerily calm. This was not chaos. This was theater. Every step of this hunt was planned. The timing, the distance, the sound. Somewhere ahead, Ernest screamed. Not in pain this time, but in pure animal terror. The kind of sound no man makes unless he has finally felt what it means to be prey. Simon followed slowly, methodically, axe in hand, as if he had all the time in the world. The snow bore the tracks of the chase, desperate footprints, broken branches, the prints of the dogs fanning out, closing in. The forest, once their kingdom, was now their labyrinth, and Simon was the one holding the key. When he reached the next clearing, the hounds were waiting, and so were Ernest and Jasper, on their knees shaking, the night having stripped away whatever dignity they had left. Simon smiled for the first time. The hunt was over. Ernest was sobbing now, the sound wet and broken, steaming in the cold air. Blood from his ruined ankle had soaked through the snow, painting the ground dark beneath him. Jasper, though still defiant, was breathing so hard he looked ready to collapse. His hands were trembling, not from cold this time, but from the first taste of a fear he had never allowed himself to feel. Simon stood over them, the axe handle resting against his shoulder. He said nothing for a long moment, letting the forest do the talking, the wind sighing through the branches, the low growl of the hounds, the creak of trees that sounded almost like voices. Joshua broke the silence first. "We should end it," he said quietly, his breath ragged. "Right here." Simon turned his head slowly, his eyes cold enough to make Joshua look away. "No," he said. "Not yet." He crouched in front of Ernest, close enough that their breath mingled in the freezing night. "You ever wonder," Simon asked softly, "what Silas felt before the dogs took him? Or what my sister felt when you sold her to strangers?" Ernest shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. But Simon wasn't really looking for an answer. "This is not about killing you," Simon continued. "Killing would be too quick. This is about giving you the same gift you gave us. A night that never ends." He gestured for Joshua to help drag them toward a nearby hollow where the earth dipped into a natural pit. They tied Ernest and Jasper to a thick fallen log, facing the open woods. The hounds lay down just outside the circle, watching, waiting, their presence a constant reminder of what could happen at any moment. Then Simon built a small fire, not for warmth, for light, so Ernest and Jasper could see the eyes watching them from the darkness all night long. Every few minutes, Simon would stand and pace, deliberately snapping branches underfoot, making sure they never forgot where he was. Whenever one of them started to doze, he would whistle, and the dogs would rise, growling until the men were awake again. It was not a night of rest. It was a night of reckoning, a slow drip of terror designed to stretch time until dawn felt like it would never come, and Simon was just getting started. The first grey light of dawn crept into the hollow like an intruder, pale and merciless. Ernest and Jasper were shivering violently, their faces ashen, lips cracked and blue. They hadn't slept. They hadn't been allowed to. Every hour had been an eternity. The growls of the hounds, the crackle of the fire, the sound of Simon's boots pacing just beyond their vision. When the sun finally broke the horizon, Simon rose from where he had been sitting on a fallen tree. The axe rested against his knee, but he didn't reach for it. He simply stood there, watching them as if weighing something unseen. Joshua looked uneasy. His hands were raw from the cold, his eyes bloodshot. He had signed up for revenge, but this slow, deliberate unraveling was beginning to shake him. "They've had their night," Joshua muttered. "Let's finish it." Simon didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on Jasper, who despite everything still held that faint curl of arrogance at the edge of his mouth, as though he couldn't believe a man like Simon could hold him here another moment. "You still think this is a game?" Simon said softly. He knelt down in front of Jasper, close enough that the younger Harding could smell the smoke on his breath. "You think this ends when I swing the axe? You think that's the worst thing I can do to you?" Jasper swallowed hard, his bravado cracking. Simon stood again, this time turning toward Ernest, who was sobbing quietly, his whole body trembling. "Look at me," Simon commanded. Ernest obeyed, tears streaking down his dirt-covered face. "This land has taken enough blood," Simon said, his voice steady, almost solemn. "I'm not going to stain it with yours." For a moment both Ernest and Jasper seemed to relax, as though mercy had finally entered the clearing. But then Simon whistled. The hounds rose as one, 6 shadows against the morning light, their growls low and eager. Simon untied the brothers and pointed toward the tree line. "You run until you can't anymore," he said coldly. "And when you fall, you pray the dogs find you before the cold does." It wasn't death he was giving them. It was a sentence. And when Ernest and Jasper staggered to their feet and began to stumble into the woods, the hounds followed. Simon didn't. He stood by the fire, watching the forest swallow them whole. By mid-morning, the forest had gone quiet again. No howls, no cries, just the sound of the wind brushing through the pines. Simon and Joshua walked back toward the plantation without speaking, their boots crunching over frost that glittered like shards of glass in the sunlight. When they reached the slave quarters, the others were awake, standing outside in the pale light. They stared at Simon as though he had returned from the dead. "Where are they?" one of the older men asked, voice trembling. Simon didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth was written all over him, in the blood dried on his boots, in the faint scratches across his hands, in the calmness in his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. Word spread quickly. By noon, the entire plantation was silent, the kind of silence that comes when fear is no longer sure where it belongs. The overseer was gone. The masters were gone. The great house stood empty, its windows dark, its front door hanging slightly ajar as though no one had the courage to shut it. Joshua busied himself with practicalities, food, water, bandaging the wounds Ernest Trapp had left on his own hands. But Simon did not enter the house. He stood at the edge of the yard, staring at the road that led back into the woods, as if expecting to see two broken figures stumbling back. But they never came. Some said the dogs tore them apart before they made it a mile. Some said they froze to death, lost in the maze of trees. Others swore they made it to the next county, mad with terror, and vanished into the world like ghosts. Simon never confirmed any of it. What mattered was not where Ernest and Jasper ended up, but what they left behind. A plantation without its masters, a kingdom without a king. That night, for the first time in decades, no bell rang at dawn. No one was ordered into the fields. The dogs stayed quiet in their kennels, resting as though they too had been set free. Simon sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames, his face lit with an expression no one could name. He hadn't killed them, but he had taken everything from them, and in doing so, he had become something far more dangerous than a murderer. By the end of that week, the Harding plantation was no longer just a place. It was a story. Word traveled fast along the hidden roads between plantations, passed in whispers around fire pits, and in coded songs sung under breath. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What had Simon done? Some swore he had killed Ernest and Jasper with his bare hands and left their bodies for the wolves. Others claimed he had fed them alive to the hounds. A few said he had simply tied them to trees and walked away, leaving them to scream into the night until the forest decided their fate. Whatever the truth, the name Simon began to mean something new. To the slaves still in chains, it meant possibility. A whisper that maybe the order of the world was not as fixed as it seemed. That maybe the men who owned the land were not untouchable. To the white planters in neighboring counties, it meant fear. Fear of what might happen if other men like Simon decided they had nothing left to lose. Fear of the dogs turning on their masters. Fear of waking in the night to find themselves staring down the same judgment. Riders began to patrol more heavily. Rewards were posted. $100 for Simon, dead or alive. But he did not run. He stayed on the plantation, moving through the empty house with a quiet, unhurried presence. He did not sleep in Ernest's bed, did not drink from his liquor cabinet, did not wear his clothes. He was not trying to become the master. He was something else entirely. At night he sat by the kennels, the hounds gathered around him like sentinels. Sometimes workers from the quarters swore they saw him talking to them, whispering words they could not hear, as if sharing secrets meant only for the forest. When strangers rode past the property, they quickened their pace. The sight of the silent fields, the dark house, the faint sound of dogs in the distance was enough to raise the hair on the back of their necks. The Harding plantation had once been a place of fear. Now it was a place of reckoning. And Simon was no longer just a man. He was the story people told when the fire burned low, when they wanted to scare each other or give each other courage. The decision to send a posse did not come quickly. For days, the neighboring planters argued among themselves. Some believed that hunting Simon would only turn him into a martyr in the eyes of their own slaves. Others feared that if they didn't act, Simon's defiance would spread like a disease, emboldening every man and woman who still bent their backs under the lash. By the second week, fear had outweighed hesitation. 20 armed men rode toward the Harding plantation at dawn. Their coats were heavy, their rifles loaded, their expressions grim. They had been promised payment, not just for capturing Simon, but for making an example of him, for restoring the order that had been broken. But Simon had been waiting for them. He had walked the land every night since Ernest and Jasper's death, memorizing every approach. He knew which road would carry the sound of hooves before the men appeared, which wind would carry their scent to the hounds. He had transformed the plantation into a labyrinth, cutting hidden paths through the fields, setting traps near the main road, scattering sharpened stakes where only he knew to step safely. And then there were the dogs. They were no longer the Harding's weapons. They were his army. Simon had fed them with care, not starving them to madness, as Ernest once did, but teaching them to obey only him. They had learned his voice, his smell, the rhythm of his steps. When he moved through the dark, they moved with him like shadows. On the morning the posse came, Simon stood at the edge of the kennel, the frost glittering on the ground like glass. Joshua joined him, silent, his hands gripping the axe they had hidden since the night of the ambush. The first sound came, distant hooves. Simon didn't speak. He didn't need to. The hounds rose as one, their bodies tense, their ears forward. The men who rode toward the plantation thought they were coming for a man. What they didn't understand, not yet, was that they were riding into something far older, something that had been growing under their feet for years, and on this day, that something was ready to meet them. The posse entered the plantation just after sunrise. The mist clung to the ground in low, twisting shapes, making the fields look like a drowned world. The house loomed in the distance, its windows dark, its chimney cold. Everything was silent. The men dismounted cautiously, the sound of their boots crunching on the frost unnaturally loud. They expected noise, work in the fields, voices from the slave quarters, the distant bark of hounds. Instead, there was nothing, not even a bird in the trees. Lioness Garrett, riding at the front, spat into the dirt and muttered that this was exactly what he expected from Simon. Cowardice, theatrics. He ordered the men to spread out and search the property. But as they moved deeper into the fields, a sound rolled over them. It wasn't a howl, not exactly. More like a low, collective growl. Dozens of throats rumbling at once, vibrating through the earth. The men froze. From somewhere beyond the mist, the hounds began to circle. They did not attack, not yet. They stayed just out of sight, letting their voices carry through, sheathed the fog like a living wall of sound. Garrett shouted for them to keep moving, but his own horse was restless, ears back, nostrils flaring. Then they found the first sign. Near the edge of the cotton field, nailed to a post, hung Ernest Harding's blood-stained coat. Below it, written in mud, were 3 words. "This is mine." The effect was immediate. Some of the younger men backed away, crossing themselves. One whispered that Simon was no longer a man but a ghost, a devil who had cursed this place. Garrett snapped at them to shut up, but even he could feel it. The sense that they were not in control here. Another growl rolled through the fog, this one closer, then another behind them. The hounds were circling, tightening the noose. And then, without warning, one single bark, sharp, commanding. The growls stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. Somewhere out there, Simon was watching, and they all knew it. This was no longer a hunt. This was a test. The first man vanished without a sound. One moment he was walking near the edge of the cotton rows, rifle raised, eyes darting through the mist. And the next, there was a sudden snap of iron, a scream choked in his throat, and then silence. When the others reached the spot, all they found was blood smeared across the frosted earth and deep drag marks leading into the trees. Garrett cursed and ordered the men to stay together. But fear is a disease, and it spreads fast. Each man's breath came quicker now, Each shadow looked like an ambush. Simon had turned the entire plantation into a battlefield, and they were already losing. Somewhere to the left, a branch snapped. One of the riders spun and fired into the fog, the shot echoing off the empty fields. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing there. Then came the second strike. A trap hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves caught another man, and by the ankle. He went down screaming, clutching at his leg as blood poured through his fingers. Before anyone could reach him, the hounds were there. Not attacking, not tearing him apart, just circling him, teeth bared, eyes glowing with hunger. The man begged the others to shoot them, but no one dared fire. The hounds weren't charging. They were waiting. Simon's shadow moved just beyond the mist, and for a brief second, Garrett saw him. Tall, still, axe in hand. Their eyes locked. Then Simon vanished again. Panic set in. Two men tried to run back toward the road, but the hounds cut them off, herding them back like cattle. The pack wasn't hunting. They were directing the posse, forcing them deeper into the fields where Simon wanted them. Joshua appeared next, stepping out from behind a tree with a rifle taken from the overturned carriage weeks earlier. He fired once, the shot taking Garrett's hat clean off and burying itself in a fence post. The message was clear. We could kill you any time we want. The posse was no longer a posse. It was prey, and Simon had only just begun. Garrett tried to hold the line. He barked orders at the men, forcing them to regroup, but their faces told him what he already knew. They were breaking. Their rifles shook in their hands, their eyes darting to every flicker of movement in the mist. Simon and Joshua stayed just out of reach, appearing only in flashes. A silhouette between two trees, a shadow moving along the fence line, the faint gleam of an axe blade catching the dawn light. Each time they appeared, another man fell. One was dragged screaming into the corn rows, never to be seen again. Another was lured toward a faint sound, the voice of a woman crying, only to step into a snare that left him dangling upside down from a tree, helpless as the hounds gathered below him. By the time the sun climbed higher, there were only 6 men left. Garrett cursed under his breath. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was a purge. He made the call to retreat, but the moment the words left his mouth, a gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the dirt at his feet, kicking up frost and soil. Simon stepped into view, just 20 paces away. He didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't gloat. He just stood there, axe in one hand, the other resting on the neck of the lead hound. Garrett froze. He had seen men look at him with hatred before. Slaves, field hands, even rival overseers. But he had never seen a look like this. Simon's face was calm, empty, not rage, not triumph. Just the cold inevitability of someone who had already decided what would happen next. "Run," Joshua called from somewhere behind Garrett. His voice was low, almost pitying. "You best run now." Garrett didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, crashing through the fields, leaving the other 5 men behind. The hounds surged after him, their howls splitting the morning. The others tried to follow, but the pack turned on them, forcing them back toward the house. Garrett didn't look back. He ran as though the devil himself was on his heels, and in a way he was. Simon let him go, but only just far enough. This wasn't over, not yet. Garrett ran until his lungs burned. Branches tore at his coat, mud splashed up his legs, but he didn't dare stop. The sound of the hounds was everywhere, not behind him anymore, but all around, weaving through the trees, closing the circle. He stumbled into the low, wet backlands beyond the plantation, where the earth turned soft and the air smelled of rot. The swamp was a place Garrett never entered. Too many snakes, too many hidden holes that could snap a horse's leg in half. But he didn't have a choice. His boots sank ankle-deep in the black water, each step slower than the last. Behind him, a single bark rang out, sharp and commanding. The hounds went silent again. Garrett froze. Somewhere in the mist, a voice called, "Out." "You remember this place?" It was Simon. Garrett spun in a circle, searching for him, but the fog was thick. and the trees stood like crooked gallows. "You brought us here once," Simon's voice came again, closer now. "When two men tried to run, you caught 'em, whipped 'em till they couldn't stand, then left them out here to die." Garrett's breath came fast. He remembered. He remembered everything. The cries of the men as the mosquitoes swarmed them, the way the night swallowed their screams. Another voice joined in. Joshua's, from the other side. "You laughed," Joshua said. "Said it was a lesson. Said this is what happens when a man forgets his place." The sound of water sloshing. Simon was moving closer. "You remember what you said next?" Garrett backed away, tripping over a root, landing hard in the mud. "You said nobody would ever come for them," Simon whispered, his voice so close now it was almost in Garrett's ear. Garrett raised his rifle with shaking hands, firing wildly into the mist. The shot echoed, then faded. Nothing. Just the sound of breathing, not his own. Then, from the fog, the hounds appeared one by one. They didn't lunge. They simply stood there, silent, watching him. Garrett was no longer the overseer, no longer the man with the whip. Out here, he was just another body waiting for the swamp to take him. And Simon was not going to let him go easy. Simon emerged from the mist like a shadow made flesh. Garrett's eyes widened. He saw the axe in Simon's hands, the cold steadiness in his stance, the silence that carried more weight than any rifle could produce. "You've run far enough," Simon said. His voice was low, precise, measured, the kind of voice that makes a man's bones feel hollow. Garrett swallowed hard. His hands shook, his throat dry. He raised the rifle one last time, but the moment stretched into eternity. Simon didn't move. The hounds didn't move. Time itself seemed to pause, waiting. "You think this ends with a shot?" Simon continued. "Do you remember, Joshua? Do you remember the fields, the lashes, the screams, every life you thought you owned?" Garrett's mouth opened, but no sound came. Simon stepped closer, each footfall deliberate. The hounds flanked him, silent sentinels. The fog wrapped around them, hiding the edges of the world, leaving only Simon, Garrett, and the memory of every cruelty the overseer had inflicted. "You see," Simon said, lowering the axe slightly, "this is the lesson you never taught. There is no master here, no whip, no fear you can impose that doesn't eventually turn on you." Garrett tried to speak again. Words failed. His knees buckled under the weight of guilt and terror. Simon's eyes bored into him. He raised the axe, not in rage, in inevitability. "You built your empire on fear," Simon said. "Every lash, every scream, every life you crushed, it all comes home." Garrett fell to his knees. The hounds circled, eyes glowing, teeth flashing just enough to remind him that escape was impossible. Simon's hand rested on the axe, the blade catching the sparse light. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "Do you finally see?" Garrett's body shook. Tears ran through the mud on his cheeks. He whispered, barely audible, I see." Simon's face didn't soften. There was no mercy here, only the quiet, devastating clarity of justice delivered by the one who had been patient enough to wait decades. "You've been taught," Simon said, voice cutting like a knife, "and I am the teacher." He stepped back, letting the hounds nudge Garrett to his feet. Not to kill him, not yet, but to make sure he would never forget the lesson. Because some punishments are not about death. They are about awakening the man to the full measure of the life he destroyed. And Garrett, trembling, mud-soaked, stripped of authority and power, finally understood the depth of the world he had never truly controlled. The morning afar, Garrett's reckoning, Simon walked through the Harding plantation like a man reclaiming a kingdom. The frost still clung to the fields, glittering cold under a pale sun, but the air felt different. Charged, electric, full of possibility. The silence that had once been oppressive now seemed to bend to his presence. Simon moved first to the slave quarters. The remaining men and women watched from the edges of the cabins, wary, uncertain. For decades they had learned to read the smallest shifts in power. A glance, a step, the lift of a hand. Today, every instinct told them this was different. He spoke only once. "You are free to live without fear," he said, voice carrying across the yard. The words were simple, but the effect was seismic. Heads lifted, shoulders straightened, eyes, dulled from years of submission, shone with cautious hope. He didn't hand out orders for work. He didn't pretend to be a master. Instead, he walked among them, learning what had been broken in the last 20 years, observing who could lead, who had the skill to protect, who had the wisdom to sustain themselves. The main house was next. The place that had been the seat of terror, the epicenter of control, stood silent. Simon entered room by room, opening windows to the cold air, letting the plantation itself breathe. He examined Ernest and Jasper's belongings, noting the symbols of their arrogance, ledgers, whips, personal effects. All were left untouched, but catalogued, evidence, reminders of the system he had dismantled. He then turned to the Hounds. They were no longer weapons. They were sentinels, companions, the living memory of what had been done and what had been reclaimed. He fed them, spoke to them, and watched as they stretched in the sun, powerful and patient. By midday, word had reached the surrounding plantations. Farmers and overseers ventured close, drawn by rumors of Simon's actions, only to find the Harding land quiet, the Hounds calm, the formerly enslaved people moving freely without fear. Simon didn't shout. He didn't provoke. He simply existed as proof that control could be seized, that the arc of fear could be broken with patience, cunning, and unwavering purpose. And the plantation itself, once a symbol of brutality, began to transform under his silent, watchful presence. Because some battles are not won with weapons alone, some are won with the mind, and Simon had proven that a man who had nothing to lose could overturn centuries of oppression, reshaping the rules of the world around him. Simon did not need to announce his presence beyond the Harding lands. Word traveled faster than any messenger. Whispered accounts of the bloodhounds, of Garrett's reckoning, and the sudden disappearance of power echoed through the neighboring counties. Planters spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward the Harding plantation, as if the air itself carried a warning. Simon understood the mechanics of fear and respect. He knew that power, once seized, was only sustainable when it was invisible, yet omnipresent. He did not ride into the towns waving banners. He did not write letters boasting of his victories. Instead, he allowed stories to grow, rumors to harden, leaving gaps that imagination filled with dread. Travelers who passed the Harding lands spoke of strange figures moving silently among the fields, the occasional flicker of a shadow, the hounds appearing at the edges of the woods. Merchants and farmhands would recount, not entirely certain if they had seen it, a man with the gaze of winter itself, eyes that measured, weighed, and calculated judgment. Simon met no resistance because resistance was impossible. The system that had sustained brutality for decades was fragile, dependent on intimidation, routine, and unquestioned obedience. All of those pillars had crumbled under his careful strategy. He began visiting nearby plantations at twilight, always unannounced, always observed from the periphery. When he spoke, it was measured. One word, one suggestion, one threat, carefully concealed beneath civility, enough to correct behavior without raising arms. And the word spread. Farmers who had once enforced terror themselves found themselves reconsidering methods, aware that the shadow of Simon's intelligence and patience could strike at any moment. He did not use violence indiscriminately. Violence, he had learned, was effective only when calibrated, purposeful, and legendary in its stories. The tale of Garrett's reckoning, of the posse hunted and broken by shadows and hounds, was sufficient to reshape a region. The plantations around Beaufort County began to feel different. Fields were still worked, Cotton still harvested, but the unseen eye of justice, one no law enforced, no overseer could resist, hovered above. Fear had shifted from instruments of cruelty to instruments of respect, and Simon's subtle dominance ensured that this new order was unchallengeable. By the winter of 1853, the ripple he had set in motion became a wave. Stories of his patience, intelligence, and precise vengeance traveled faster than any military report. Men who once ruled by fear now calculated carefully, aware that the hidden hand of someone far sharper and more disciplined had redefined the rules. And Simon, ever patient, remained silent, waiting for the right moment to act again. Inside the Harding plantation, the air had shifted completely. What had once been an ecosystem of fear and submission was now a web of cautious respect and quiet autonomy. Simon walked through the quarters each morning, observing. He learned who had the strength to lead, who carried scars deeper than the visible, and who could be entrusted with responsibility. He did not impose arbitrary rules or display overt authority. Every word, every gesture was deliberate, a test, a lesson, a subtle calibration of power. He introduced systems without announcing them. Cooking schedules, work rotations, and the tending of livestock were reorganized quietly, with instructions given directly to those who had the competence and intelligence to manage them. Those who failed or resisted were corrected not with punishment, but with the silent weight of observation, the unmistakable feeling that their actions were known, measured, and accounted for. Simon studied human behavior as a general studies his battlefield. He watched interactions, body language, how men and women approached decisions, how they looked at one another. Loyalty was never assumed. It was earned, observed, and reinforced. Those who demonstrated initiative or courage were quietly empowered. Those who succumbed to fear or hesitation were guided, subtly, towards self-awareness and responsibility. The Hounds remained central, symbols of power and precision. They were no longer instruments of cruelty, but of protection and vigilance. Their presence reminded everyone that control existed, not through terror, but through the patience and intelligence of a master who understood the mind as deeply as the body. Simon began assigning small tasks that tested judgment. Who could distribute resources? Who could settle minor disputes? Who could lead in emergencies? Each trial strengthened the internal hierarchy, while emphasizing personal accountability. He never interfered unless absolutely necessary. His authority was a shadow, invisible yet omnipresent. By the end of winter, the plantation functioned with efficiency previously unseen. The formerly enslaved people moved through their days with a sense of dignity and empowerment. They no longer feared being watched for mistakes. They understood that they were being observed for their capacity to act wisely. Simon understood that real power was not in fear alone, but in the cultivation of order through respect, intellect, and the careful shaping of behavior. And in that cold December sunlight, walking among fields he now controlled, he recognized that the hardest lesson had been learned, both by him and by everyone who had survived under his careful watch. The plantation was no longer a place of oppression. It was a place of awakening, the first step in a larger reckoning yet to come. Simon knew that controlling the plantation was only the beginning. True power required influence beyond the fences, beyond the hounds, beyond the visible. He had learned that fear alone could enforce obedience, but perception, subtlety, and strategy could reshape entire communities. He began observing the surrounding counties from a distance, tracking routines, listening to whispers, noting the unspoken rules that bound men to their own systems of control. The plan was not chaos, not rebellion, but a restructuring, silent, invisible, unstoppable. Every gesture, every word, every rumor would be orchestrated like pieces on a chessboard. Messengers, merchants, and itinerant travelers became unwitting carriers of his narrative. They spoke of strange happenings at the Harding plantation, shadows that moved without source, hounds that appeared and disappeared with the mist, men who had once ruled with impunity, now cowed by invisible hands. The story of Garrett's reckoning spread, evolving in every telling. It was no longer just a tale of revenge. It was a lesson, a warning, a principle embedded in the psyche of all who heard it. Simon visited the edges of these counties at twilight, walking unseen, observing, listening. He learned who held true power and who merely pretended to. He catalogued weaknesses, recorded patterns, and sowed subtle signs that someone was watching. The flick of a shadow, a missing tool, a quietly rearranged fence post. The people did not know what they feared, only that fear had shifted from overt violence to a presence they could not escape or comprehend. He partnered silently with those who demonstrated foresight, intelligence, or courage. He rewarded initiative in quiet ways, a tool left where needed, advice given at the precise moment, protection from unseen threats. These alliances were invisible yet unbreakable, built on mutual understanding and the unspoken respect of someone who had mastered patience and strategy. By the end of that first winter, Simon had extended his influence without firing a shot or raising his voice beyond the plantation. The counties themselves had begun to bend subtly toward his order. Men who once ruled with arrogance now hesitated. Women who once endured quietly began to act with awareness and purpose. Simon understood the fundamental truth. Power was not maintained by cruelty alone. It was maintained by knowledge, precision, and the invisible force of inevitability. And in this quiet expansion of control, he realized that the awakening had only just begun, both for himself and for the world he was quietly remaking. By the spring of 1853, the subtle threads Simon had woven through the surrounding counties began to solidify into tangible shifts. Markets, town meetings, and trading posts reflected patterns he had carefully orchestrated, although no one could identify the source. Decisions once made in arrogance and ignorance now carried a caution born of whispered warnings and unseen observation. Merchants found themselves reconsidering the prices they charged, aware of a presence in the county that monitored fairness, honesty, and intent. Overseers and plantation owners, previously unchallenged, noticed minor disruptions: tools misplaced, livestock moved, shipments delayed. Each incident was small, innocuous to an observer unaware of the design, but cumulative, deliberate, and unsettling. Simon never intervened directly. His power was the silent weight behind events, the knowledge that every decision was being watched. By allowing local actors to believe they were free, he drew out the intentions, revealing greed, cruelty, or ignorance. Those who acted wisely were quietly reinforced. Those who acted rashly learned consequences, small, mysterious, and escalating. He attended town councils from the shadows, walking among the crowd unseen, cataloguing alliances, weaknesses, and ambitions. He observed who spoke truth, who manipulated the system, and who wielded authority through fear alone. Patterns emerged quickly. People trusted appearances, but Simon understood the mechanics of behavior. What was visible could be a lie. What was unseen always spoke the truth. The psychological pressure he exerted created changes in governance without anyone realizing the origin. Tax collectors found themselves pressured to enforce fairness. Judges hesitated before issuing arbitrary punishments. Local leaders began consulting their subordinates, learning to negotiate instead of dominate. The counties were becoming, slowly, something new, a reflection of the strategic intelligence that guided them, though they believed themselves independent. Commerce, too, responded to the invisible hand. Trade routes shifted, suppliers and buyers adjusted, and small innovations emerged, all encouraged subtly through selective guidance and the perception of an unseen overseer who demanded competence. Success became tied not to power or cruelty, but to foresight, caution, and the careful calibration of decisions. By the end of the season, Simon had transformed the counties in a manner both profound and invisible. Men and women moved through their days guided by an unseen force, recalibrating behavior in response to what they sensed but could not name. The shadow of Simon's mind stretched across the region, quiet, patient, inevitable. The lesson was clear. True control was not violence, not fear, not threat, It was perception, patience, and mastery of the human mind. Simon understood that his power, no matter how calculated, would be fleeting if he relied solely on himself. Knowledge, science, and presence were powerful, but to truly reshape the world around him, he needed agents who could act with both discretion and authority. He began instructing the formerly enslaved, selecting men and women who demonstrated intelligence, foresight, and courage. He taught them more than survival. He taught them observation, strategy, and the subtle art of influence. Every word was measured, every lesson grounded in reality. They learned to read people, to anticipate decisions, and to act decisively without drawing attention. Simon's teaching was quiet but deliberate. He never called them soldiers or servants of justice. They were apprentices, observers of human behavior, inheritors of patience and precision. Under his guidance, the formerly enslaved transformed into a network of eyes and ears, capable of quietly reshaping interactions in markets, towns, and even neighboring plantations. Assignments were subtle. Who should deliver messages? Who could intervene in disputes? Who could guide commerce without seeming to influence it? Each participant acted independently, yet all decisions were guided by Simon's overarching understanding of cause and effect. He created systems of trust and accountability, rewarding initiative and intelligence, while quietly curbing mistakes. The Hounds, symbols of his former authority, remained at the plantation, but their presence was also a lesson for the apprentices. Power is preserved not only through fear, but through the discipline to observe and act with precision. Simon impressed upon them that influence was more potent than overt violence, that subtle control over perception could achieve what brute force never could. By the summer of 1853, the network extended across Beaufort County. Disputes among plantation owners, traders, and overseers began to resolve in ways that reflected Simon's unseen hand. Efficiency increased, arbitrary cruelty declined, and decisions began to favor foresight over caprice. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the change, attributing it to luck, chance, or mysterious providence. Simon allowed the perception of inevitability to grow. The formerly enslaved, trained and guided, became silent architects of a new order, implementing changes he had designed while remaining invisible themselves. And through it all, Simon watched, patient, knowing that true mastery was measured not by domination, but by the quiet, unchallenged transformation of an entire region. Simon understood that perception is as powerful as action. To cement his influence, he began introducing symbolic acts, gestures, patterns, and rituals designed to create a sense of inevitability and omnipresence. These were not hollow superstitions. They were carefully calculated psychological tools that shaped behavior before any direct intervention was necessary. At the plantation, he marked certain trees, left subtle signs along paths, and created signals that apprentices could interpret. These markers conveyed messages of timing, readiness, and caution. To the uninitiated eye, they were ordinary, but to those who had learned to read them, they were instructions, warnings, and assurances that the unseen network was watching. He orchestrated the movement of the hounds with precision, letting their presence ripple through fields and forests at times when men least expected it. A sudden howl, a shadow in the mist, or a fleeting glimpse of their powerful forms in the distance became stories whispered from town to town. These tales grew with each retelling, elevating Simon's influence from fear to legend. Simon also cultivated ritualized practices among his apprentices. Meetings were held at twilight, under the cover of fog or the canopy of trees, where observation, patience, and discipline were taught through demonstration rather than words. Apprentices learned the cadence of power, when to act, when to weigh it when silence was more commanding than speech. These practices instilled confidence, precision, and an understanding that mastery came from control of both mind and circumstance. Even small symbolic acts reinforced authority. A rope left in a particular pattern, a gate intentionally left slightly open, or a pile of tools arranged with intent, all signaled knowledge and foresight. Those who observed learned caution, Those who acted rashly revealed themselves. Through these measures, Simon's presence became mythic. Stories spread that he could appear and disappear at will, that his hounds could traverse miles unseen, that those who acted against order were inevitably reminded of unseen consequences. Fear had shifted into awe, a subtle but unshakable acknowledgement of power that no law or soldier could enforce. By embedding symbolism, ritual, and calculated visibility into the daily life of the county, Simon transformed influence into legend. Men and women acted with caution, not because they had seen him, but because they sensed him everywhere, and in this quiet, omnipresent control, he perfected the art of psychological dominance, a shadow that would stretch far beyond the borders of the Harding plantation. Simon knew that influence over perception alone was powerful, but real control required the channels of society itself: politics, commerce, and law. He began guiding his apprentices to infiltrate these systems, quietly altering outcomes without ever appearing directly. Each apprentice became an agent of subtle change, moving unseen through the structures that once perpetuated cruelty and chaos. At local markets, apprentices negotiated trades and loans that favored foresight over greed. Suppliers and merchants were subtly coerced into compliance, not through threats, but through precise timing and the sense of inevitable observation. Transactions once governed by arrogance and exploitation now aligned with the principles Simon had embedded: fairness, patience, and strategic calculation. Even those unaware of his presence adapted to the invisible pressure, their actions molded by anticipation of consequences that seemed unavoidable. Political influence followed naturally. Town meetings, tax collections, and disputes among planters were subtly reshaped. An apprentice would deliver a carefully chosen piece of information or arrange for a particular observer to witness a minor misstep. Decisions that once favored cruelty or rashness were replaced by prudence and caution. Those who attempted to dominate unchecked found their strategies quietly undermined, while those who acted with foresight received unseen reinforcement. Simon's genius lay in invisibility. He never attended these councils, never addressed merchants openly, never positioned himself as authority. Instead, he orchestrated events like a composer conducting a symphony from the shadows. Every move reinforced a pattern. Power could be wielded without visibility, influence could spread without confrontation, and control could exist everywhere at once. The network of formerly enslaved men and women became essential to this operation. They carried messages, observed behaviors, and ensured compliance with precision. Each individual understood their role, acting independently but coordinated through Simon's vision. He cultivated their abilities without ever showing favor openly, creating loyalty rooted in respect, mastery, and shared purpose rather than fear or reward alone. By the summer of 1854, Beaufort County's social, economic, and political landscape had shifted in subtle yet undeniable ways. Power no longer resided solely with the wealthy or the violent. It flowed through the unseen, guided by intellect, patience, and strategic mastery. And as Simon watched from the shadows, he understood a crucial truth. The most enduring influence is invisible, and the most formidable power is the one that others believe they control themselves. Theirs. Simon's vision extended far beyond Beaufort County. He understood that isolated influence, no matter how precise, was fragile. True power demanded breadth, a network spanning multiple counties, each node connected by trust, observation, and subtle control. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his reach, sending apprentices to neighboring regions under the guise of work, trade, or necessity. Each newcomer carried more than their labor. They carried Simon's methodology. They observed, catalogued, and acted according to principles he had drilled into them: discretion, foresight, precision. Minor interventions, guiding a merchant to favor one buyer over another, ensuring a town councilman made a cautious decision, or exposing small mismanagement, were compounded across distances. These interventions appeared random, yet together formed a pattern of influence that was undeniable. though invisible. Legends began to grow. Stories of a man who could control outcomes without appearing, whose hounds could appear miles from their kennels, whose eyes seemed to be everywhere. These tales spread like wildfire. To those unfamiliar with Simon's network, his influence seemed supernatural, mythic. They spoke in hushed tones of his intelligence, patience, and inevitability. Simon nurtured this mythology deliberately. Apprentices allowed hints of his presence to reach ears that would carry the story, carefully embellishing without distortion. Every tale reinforced his reputation. Every whispered warning strengthened obedience and caution. Every observation of his network deepened respect. Fear was no longer necessary. Awe was sufficient. Even local authorities, previously arrogant and unquestioned, began second-guessing their actions. Merchants altered pricing, landowners reconsidered punishments, and overseers became cautious in public displays of cruelty. Decisions were being guided without confrontation, laws influenced without legislation, and commerce adjusted without contracts. The counties were bending to an unseen hand, learning to anticipate an influence they could not define. Through it all, Simon remained a shadow, never seen, never claiming credit, never stepping into the light. His power was psychological, strategic, and absolute, rooted in patience and subtle orchestration rather than brute force. By connecting Beaufort with surrounding regions through observation, apprentices, and carefully placed influence, he had created a web of control that transcended traditional authority. And in the quiet of the night, walking among fields, forests, and invisible boundaries, Simon understood a final crucial truth. The most formidable empire is the one built not with armies, but with minds aligned, willingly or unknowingly, to the will of a single, disciplined strategist. Simon knew that true mastery required more than compliance from individuals. It demanded understanding and manipulation of institutions themselves. Law enforcement, local governance, and the formal structures of control were fragile constructs, often upheld by fear, assumption, and habit rather than reason. He saw cracks in the system, fissures caused by arrogance, ignorance, and the illusion of authority, and he exploited them with surgical precision. Apprentices infiltrated these structures carefully. One would observe a magistrate's habits, another would note a constable's predictable routines. Simon instructed them to sow subtle doubts, misplaced papers, whispered rumors, discrepancies in records. These minor disruptions eroded confidence in officials, compelling them to hesitate, second-guess, and ultimately act more cautiously. The result was a system that operated slower, less arbitrarily, and increasingly in line with Simon's unseen influence. Courts became arenas of subtle guidance. Simon's apprentices ensured evidence appeared where needed, witnesses spoke at opportune moments, and decisions favored prudence over tyranny. He never Ted openly. He understood that institutions defended themselves fiercely against visible threats, but were malleable when change came imperceptibly. Over time, judges, sheriffs, and council members began to sense a presence they could not confront, an intelligence that observed every decision and predicted every move. Even the local militias, those who once acted with unchecked force, began exercising restraint. Simon allowed stories of his omnipresence to reach them. A hound seen at dusk in the forest, a shadow crossing the moonlit field, and the psychological effect was profound. Men who prided themselves on courage found themselves questioning every decision, anticipating consequences that appeared to exist without source. This phase was not about terror, it was about inevitability. Simon's unseen network reshaped behaviors within institutions without a single direct confrontation. Mistakes were quietly corrected, chaos redirected, and authority subtly realigned to serve principles of foresight, calculation, and equilibrium. The system itself became a tool of his design, bending toward an order he alone understood. By the end of the season, Beaufort County and its surroundings operated under an invisible hand, a silent architect who orchestrated compliance, wisdom, and restraint. Power no longer resided in the arrogance of individual men. It flowed through perception, strategy, and the quiet, methodical work of a mind that had learned to see the world in patterns invisible to all but itself. And Simon watched it all, knowing the most enduring dominion is not claimed by force, but by shaping the very rules others believe govern them. Simon understood that the human mind responds to symbols long before it responds to reason. To solidify his influence, he began embedding rituals, subtle, almost imperceptible patterns, into the social and political life of the county. As these rituals were not mere superstition, they were psychological tools, invisible levers that compelled obedience and shaped perception without overt control. Meetings, market exchanges, and even casual gatherings became arenas for these symbols. Apprentices would place objects in precise arrangements, initiate minor gestures, or time their movements to create patterns others could sense but not consciously interpret. A slightly crooked fence post, a lantern placed in an unusual spot, a particular arrangement of goods at a stall, all conveyed messages of observation, order, and inevitability. Those attuned to these symbols acted with caution. Those ignorant of them were guided without realizing it. Simon also manipulated timing. Community events, harvest routines, and even court sessions were subtly altered to reinforce the perception that some unseen intelligence controlled outcomes. People began to anticipate patterns, when they would meet, how transactions would unfold, and even how authority figures would act. This anticipation created the illusion of inevitability, the sense that resistance was futile and compliance was not only prudent but inevitable. Stories of Simon's presence grew with each ritual. Hounds glimpsed in misty fields, shadows moving in synchronization with town activity, and seemingly coincidental events that resolved in his favor became legend. The network of apprentices ensured these stories reached the right ears, enhancing both fear and awe. To the uninitiated, his control seemed supernatural. To those within his network, it was a disciplined, practiced mastery of cause and effect. By embedding ritual into everyday life, Simon transformed influence into a form of myth. Authority figures began to differ subtly, communities adopted patterns aligned with his unseen design, and compliance became instinctive rather than coerced. The counties were reshaped from the inside out, not by visible domination, but through the quiet manipulation of perception and expectation. Through these symbolic acts, Simon's presence transcended physical reality. He was no longer merely a man in the shadows. He was an idea, a force, a measure of inevitability that guided behavior, controlled outcomes, and demanded respect without ever stepping into the light. Simon understood that legend required a moment, a demonstration of power subtle enough to maintain invisibility, yet undeniable enough to inspire awe. By the fall of 1854, the counties had grown accustomed to his influence, whispering about the unseen hand that guided markets, disputes, and authority itself. But he knew that a single calculated confrontation would transform rumor into unassailable myth. The opportunity arose when a coalition of wealthy planters, threatened by the subtle changes Simon had seeded, decided to assert control. They conspired to punish those apprentices who had begun enforcing fair trade and humane practices, intending to restore fear as the governing principle. Simon observed the planning with the precision of a general, noting timing, routines, and weaknesses in coordination. Every detail was recorded, every opportunity catalogued. On a fog-laden morning, the confrontation began. Apprentices positioned themselves in key locations, not to fight, but to channel movement, anticipate action, and expose errors. Simon's planning ensured that those who sought to dominate were caught in a web of their own making. Gates closed at precise moments. Paths led them into zones where their visibility was compromised, and subtle cues, a lantern here, a strategically placed tool there, directed behavior toward outcomes they could not foresee. When the plan reached its apex, the wealthy planters found themselves isolated, surrounded by unseen opposition. No hands were raised directly by Simon, yet every decision they made amplified their vulnerability. Panic spread as they realized. The counties themselves seemed to resist them, as if an invisible force had rewritten the rules of engagement. Their influence evaporated not through violence, but through precise manipulation of circumstance. Stories of that day spread quickly. Witnesses spoke of shadows moving with intention, of the hounds appearing and disappearing like ghosts, and of men and women who acted with authority beyond their apparent status. The legend of Simon, already whispered from town to town, became undeniable. People did not question his existence. They deferred, anticipated, and aligned themselves with the pattern he had established. Through this confrontation, Simon demonstrated a critical truth. Power does not require visibility. It requires strategy, observation, and the ability to orchestrate events with precision. Institutions, men, and entire communities bend not to those who wield brute force, but to those who understand the invisible threads of influence. By the end of that day, the counties had acknowledged, silently and collectively, a presence that transcended fear, a mythic authority that would guide behavior for years to come, unseen but absolute. Simon knew that true mastery is not momentary. It is enduring. Legends fade, fear dissipates, and even awe can erode if not continuously reinforced. He turned his attention to consolidation, building systems that ensured his influence would persist long after any single action or confrontation. Apprentices became coordinators of observation, messengers of intent, and guardians of the patterns he had meticulously established. Every county had its node of control. Traders, minor officials, and influential citizens were quietly guided, their decisions nudged by a network they could never fully perceive. Simon ensured that influence was self-reinforcing, obedience and prudence rewarded by subtle advantages, missteps corrected by imperceptible interventions. Over time, this invisible architecture became a lattice of power spanning multiple counties, where even those unaware of its existence operated in alignment with H's designs. It was at this stage that Simon introduced the symbolic phrase, a tool to cement identity, loyalty, and engagement among those who had witnessed, participated in, or benefited from his network. He understood the human need for ritual and affirmation. The phrase was simple yet profound, a linguistic key that would transform mere observation into conscious alignment. Apprentices were instructed to repeat it internally and aloud at strategic moments, binding their actions to the network, reinforcing discipline, and acknowledging the invisible order that governed outcomes. Simon addressed his closest followers directly, not with overt commands, but as a mentor, revealing truths forbidden to the uninitiated. "Remember this phrase," he said, voice low but firm. "Repeat it twice, and let it mark your awareness. It is more than words. It is a signal that you see, that you understand, that you belong to something greater than yourself." The repetition was essential. The first invocation acknowledged comprehension. The second reinforced integration, a psychological locking of identity to purpose. Even beyond apprentices, Simon understood the power of suggestion. Tales of the phrase, whispered to those who had witnessed events from a distance, began circulating. It was a key to perception, a tool to engage minds, and a signal of transformation for those ready to align with his influence. By embedding ritual, repetition, and language into the system, Simon ensured that control was not just structural, but psychological, reaching into the minds of those both near and far. By the end of this phase, Simon's work had transcended the physical. Influence, legend, ritual, and engagement converged. Beaufort and surrounding counties no longer operated merely under the weight of fear or expectation. They moved in silent coordination with the unseen architect, responding instinctively to the patterns Simon had woven. Now the moment arrives where influence becomes conscious. Simon knew that unseen control is powerful, but engagement, deliberate, acknowledged engagement, is transformative. To cement loyalty, awareness, and alignment, he introduced the symbolic phrase, a verbal key designed to awaken recognition in those ready to step into the network of insight. The phrase was deceptively simple, yet potent, a combination of words that resonated with perception, authority, and transformation. Simon instructed his apprentices to repeat it aloud, twice, as a conscious act of identity. The first repetition anchored attention, the second locked awareness into the system, linking action with recognition, observation with comprehension. It was not a mantra for the faint of heart, it was an initiation into seeing the world through the lens of strategy, patience, and invisible control. He explained its purpose carefully. "This phrase is not magic," he said, voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of inevitability. "It is a marker, a signal to yourself that you understand patterns others cannot perceive. Repeat it twice, and let it shape the way you move through the world. Let it remind you that power is not taken, it is recognized, understood, and applied." Each apprentice understood that the ritual was both internal and external, a psychological contract binding mind and action to the invisible network. Beyond apprentices, Simon leveraged the phrase for broader engagement. Stories of its meaning, whispers of its power, and hints of its effect were shared in marketplaces, taverns, and among travelers. Those who encountered it became participants in a subtle form of psychological alignment, repeating it silently or aloud, consciously or instinctively, and reinforcing the perception that a controlling presence was everywhere. Even now, centuries later, Simon's methodology can be observed in how patterns propagate. Engagement amplifies influence, repetition solidifies identity, and symbolic language shapes behavior without overt authority. By asking his followers to speak, to recognize, and to internalize the phrase, he ensured that control was no longer invisible alone. It was co-created. So here in this moment, repeat after me, once, and then again. Say it aloud in your mind or in the space around you. Let it settle. Let it mark you. Let it bind you to observation, understanding, and awareness. This is the bridge between passive perception and active alignment. This is the moment when knowledge becomes transformation. Simon's story does not end with a single act of revenge or a moment of confrontation. It extends across decades, counties, and generations, a testament to the enduring power of calculated patience, invisible influence, and psychological mastery. By the time his apprentices were trained, the counties were no longer merely communities. They were living expressions of his strategy, moving in patterns only he could fully comprehend. Every merchant, minor official, and townsperson who had encountered his network acted within the invisible architecture Simon had constructed. The symbolic phrase repeated in whispers and in thought became more than ritual. It became a mental compass, a reminder that power is recognized and exercised by those who understand the invisible threads that bind human behavior. Even today, the principle remains. Influence is strongest when it is unseen, inevitability when it is misunderstood, and control when the subjects believe they act freely. Simon's genius was the creation of a system that transcended time and visibility. The hounds of his youth, once instruments of fear and death, became metaphors for observation and precision. The lessons learned from patience, planning, and strategic execution were encoded into generations of apprentices who carried the principles forward, never questioning the necessity of the unseen hand guiding their actions. Every decision, every interaction, every whispered warning became part of a web that ensured compliance, respect, and alignment without the need for force. But the most profound truth of Simon's legacy is psychological. He transformed not only the landscape of Beaufort and surrounding counties, but the very understanding of what power can be. He showed that the mind itself is the ultimate terrain to master, that fear can be replaced by awe, and that influence is strongest when it is co-created through observation, anticipation, and subtle manipulation. His empire was invisible, yet absolute, silent, yet undeniable. And now, as you reflect on this story, understand this. The principles that guided Simon are not relics of the past. They exist wherever patience, perception, and strategic execution meet opportunity. The capacity to influence, to observe, and to shape outcomes without confrontation is a power that can be cultivated by anyone willing to learn, to wait, and to act with precision. The question now rests with you. Will you see the patterns? Will you recognize the invisible threads that govern outcomes? Will you repeat the phrase, twice, and allow it to anchor you to awareness? Because once understood, once integrated, the world no longer moves blindly around you. You move through it with vision, strategy, and the quiet certainty of a mind that has glimpsed the hidden architecture of power. Simon's empire was not built on fear alone. It was built on mastery. And mastery, once claimed, is eternal.